Hello and welcome to Supercars Secrets, brought to you by supercarsmonaco.com. Today we're doing a buyer's guide on the iconic Lamborghini Countach, and I'm joined from his Aladdin's Cave workshop by our resident classic car expert, Iain Tyrrell. Iain, welcome to the show.
Hello, welcome to the workshop.
Thank you. Now, we seem to have gone from the kind of sexy curves of the Miura in the 60s to this much more space age, angular looking device in the 70s. And yet I believe it came out of pretty much the same design office.
Well, more than that, it was, if history serves us correctly, it was the same person, actually. The 60s were all about curves and sort of, as you say, the sensual look of the E-Type Jaguar, the Miura, Ferrari 275, things like that. And the 70s got more attitude, if you like, really. Angularism came in more. But the guy who designed the Miura was a guy called Marcello Gandini. And he also designed the Countach. There were actually two brilliant designers working for the studio Bertoni at the time. The other one was Giorgetto Giugiaro, who went on to have a very illustrious career of his own. He started Ital Design. And there are a couple of question marks over who actually designed the Countach specifically. Giugiaro has a bit of a claim to fame with it, but we're splitting hairs. For the benefit of common sense, Gandini designed them both. And of course, he worked for Bertoni, which was one of, probably with Pininfarina, the two top styling houses in Italy, all during that period.
Okay. What do you think it is about the Countach that makes it so special?
Well, I think it's the fact that it ticks so many boxes, really. First and foremost, it's what I would call a poster car. So kids in the 1980s, such as myself, teenagers, whatever. Athena, the famous poster company, did a poster of it. Kids had them on their bedroom walls. They had a picture of a Countach. It was either black or white normally, on their bedroom wall. And in fact, we had the black Countach here that the Athena poster artist used as the model for that poster in the 1980s. So number one, they're a poster car. They've got drop-dead gorgeous looks. Even today, they still look like a bit of a spaceship, really. Point number two is they weren't like the sort of plethora of manufacturers that were around at the time that used Italian styling, but American iron to power them, big V8. They actually had their own, by that stage, thoroughbred V12 engine, though Lamborghini never really went racing. But the engine's still a thoroughbred. They used that fully Italian 4-cam V12. So the engineering matched the looks. That's quite a biggie, really. A lot of these cars, as I say, things like the De Tomaso Pantera, cars of that era just slotted an American V8 in to admittedly a lovely body shell. But this is next level. It's top level. You've got beautiful drop-dead poster styling, impeccable engineering of a very high level. It was one of the 2 or 3 fastest production cars in the world during its life. It ticks just about every box imaginable, really, in that sense.
Okay. And by supercar standards, it had a really long production life, didn't it? What were the main kind of milestones and model upgrades that happened during that production life?
Well, the Countach sort of made itself a hostage to fortune. It was announced, it was first shown to an absolutely shocked world at the 1971 Geneva Motor Show, which historically has been the shop window for manufacturers to bring something shocking and radical. And the Countach was certainly that. But the problem was the car wasn't actually fully developed. So Bob Wallace, the test driver at Lamborghini, it took him 3 years to actually make the car production ready by road testing and development. They had big problems with cooling. They had problems with the 5-litre engine that they wanted to put in it. They couldn't get it to be reliable, so they went back to the 4-litre engine from the Miura and the Espada, their sort of staple V12. So when the car didn't actually hit production till 74. And the early cars, Lamborghini were always limited by tyre technology. They wanted to push the boundaries, but Pirelli, who was one of the most cutting-edge tyre manufacturers in the world, almost couldn't keep up with them. So the early Countaches, we call them now the periscopio models, because they have a sort of slot in the roof that was originally intended to be the rear view mirror. It was on the prototype, but never made it to production. But the periscopios, the 150 and 152 periscopios that were built, they're the sort of most desirable Countach now, the early ones, the purest ones. So they're easily recognizable because they don't have the flared wheel arches or the spoilers and the great big, huge wide wheels that were the hallmark of the later Countaches. So that the first cars, the periscopios with the flat sides, no bulging wheel arches, they're the most desirable of the lot. And then they had 4 or 5 generations after that. They went on to the Countach S, which again, Pirelli eventually came up with a low profile tyre, which almost every car has these days. But in the late 1970s, this was shockingly radical, really. So they came up with low profile tyres, and then that allowed Lamborghini to make the S Countach with the big wheel arches, the big wheels. And then that went through 2 or 3 generations. They eventually brought out the 5-litre engine in 1982 to bring it back to where the original concept started life. Then they went on to the Quattrovalvo, as it was called, in 1985, which is the car that's behind me. Actually, the car that's behind me is the 88.5, because it was brought out halfway through 1988. And this is identifiable by some side skirts, which I can show you later. Very rare model, this. And then the final Countach, which was interestingly made in the largest numbers because it was the sort of booming late 1980s, the yuppie period. And they made 650 odd Countach anniversaries, as they're called, which were originally developed by Horacio Pagani, who worked for Lamborghini at the time. And they have the sort of the rather radical body kit on them, which most people don't like. And the ironic part of it is they're otherwise the best car, but the body kit kills them. Looks wise and desirability wise, people just that they would prefer to have another Countach. So the anniversary, in a way, is the least valuable Countach. It's interesting because normally the last of a series of classic cars, in a way, can be the most desirable, but in this case, it's not. It's the first.
So for me as a buyer trying to decide, which model to go for from that long run and all those different upgrades you talked about, I mean, are some of them easier to live with than others, would you say, in the modern world?
Yes, most definitely. So there's so they started making the Countach in '74, and they stopped making it in 1990. So as you say, it was a 16-year production span, which is enormous for a cutting-edge supercar, really. But in 1980, what they realized was that a lot of people couldn't actually fit comfortably in a Countach. It was too small. The cabin was too small. The whole thing was too claustrophobic. So they brought out what's called the high-body Countach. And they actually raised the roofline. This car behind me is a high-body car because it's made after 1980. They actually almost invisibly changed the whole car grew a fraction, and particularly upwards, so that you could actually sit in them without craning your neck like this if you were long in the body like me. So the later high-bodied Countaches from sort of April, May 1980 onwards are easier to live with. And as I say, the later cars, the 4-valve cars, because they're a bit more roomy, they redesigned the seat to give a little more headroom, and because they altered various things on the suspension, fine-tuning, things like that. So in a way, the last of the series are the best to drive, but the early ones are more raw. A bit like E-Type Jaguars, same thing.
Okay, so in a sense, I'm starting to feel that there's a challenging trade-off coming here. Because I think what I'm hearing from you is that the earlier models possibly are the most desirable from a collector's perspective, but the later ones are the more desirable from a driving and ownership perspective.
That's exactly right, because it does happen and I know people who use their Countachs and go on big road trips for thousands of kilometers, but generally people don't cover long distances in Countachs that much. So they can put up with inconveniences and lack of creature comforts and being scrunched up inside them. Yeah, the early cars are the most desirable, but the later cars drive better.
So what does that all translate to in terms of value in today's market then?
Well, the early cars, the Periscopios, are streets ahead in terms of value compared to the others. Countachs have held up pretty well in the current sort of market, the transient market that we're in now. The Periscopio cars have been going for as much as the thick end of £1 million if they're in the right condition and have the right history. The LP400S and LP500S, the models after that, round about £400,000, huge drop. So worth less than half the value of the Periscope cars. Quattrovalvos maybe a touch more for 400, 450. And then the anniversary cars can go for sort of £250,000, something like that. So there's a definite pecking order.
Wow, that's amazing. Well, I think really, before I decide, I need to try and understand what I can look for. So to enter into the period, I think I need to kind of open my shirt to the waist and put a great big gold medallion on. So while I'm doing that, maybe you could just walk us around that car and tell us the sort of things we should be looking for.
Absolutely. Well, the car is hand built in the truest sense of the word. The car has a very stout space frame, as it's called, a tubular frame underneath the car, and generally speaking, they survive pretty well. So unless the car's had a really bad accident, the tubular space frame is a very stout bit of kit. It can rust if it's exposed or gets scrawped underneath or something like that. But they are on that space frame. What happens is the whole of this bodywork, you can actually hear how thin it is. You can see it flexing there. Is hand formed aluminium. So the whole car is very, very thin for lightness. Again, you can hear that. It's very, very thin, and the bodywork is sort of hung over that space frame, and then the mechanicals, the engine, is slotted in the back here. It goes in this way. Engine, the gearbox is in front, and when you actually change the gear with the gear lever, there's no remote control, there's no linkage. You're actually on top of the gearbox. It's between you when you sat in the car. So it's quite a sort of hand-built car, really. It's very unusual in lots and lots of ways. Things I'd be looking for are, is the car in good condition? If you look down the sides, are they nice and smooth? Are there any ripples? Because the bodywork is so delicate. You know, this car is perfect. It's got a beautiful reflection. This car's never had any paint work. It's incredibly well preserved. This car's done less than 10,000 kilometers from new. So it's really a sort of example, if you like, of what they should be like. But the thing is, the interiors can wear on them as well. This car hasn't done, because it's still lovely. This is the original leather from 1988. But this is the exception. They don't generally stand up to wear and tear like this. They're quite delicate. So it's you know, it needs somebody to hold somebody's hand, really, if you're involved in this process. It's very difficult to give an overview of what specifically to look for, but generally the more hand-built a car is, the more thoroughbred it is, for want of a better way of putting it. The more it's like a racehorse. It needs to be kept in tip-top condition, and it can easily be damaged in some way. It needs to just look of a piece, and it needs to all look lovely. And there's two ways that's achieved. One is through stunning originality, such as this car, and the other one is that it's been restored by somebody who knows what they're doing.
And so is there a potential for a buyer to look for what you might call a project car that needs that restoration? And can you pick up a little bit of a bargain if you find that kind of car?
You can. They are around. They're not commonplace because Countach's, they are occasionally, and it does happen that they just get left in a garage, in a collection, unkempt and unused. But generally speaking, pride of ownership is a big factor. You know, people love Countach's, people cherish them, people keep on top of them. But yeah, there are projects. I know of cars that are projects which can be bought and brought back. Yeah, they are out there. Yes, and
Okay.
that it should of course be reflected in the price. It should be cost of purchase plus the cost of restoration should bring you up to market value if that's possible. Yeah.
But also, I mean, from my own perspective, looking at it there, I mean, just the engine and gearbox are squeezed into that little compartment there. I could imagine that, you know, if all was not well deep down in the engine, I could imagine some fairly large bills being on the way for the new owner.
Yeah. They're not simple from an engineering point of view. No, not at all. No, they need very special attention, really.
Okay. And just a final factor, I suppose, in terms of what could determine value would be what in the art world they call provenance. You know, that could be who's owned it or concours it's won or whoever. So does that add value to a Countach? And in what sort of ways could we look for provenance as well?
Absolutely. The thing about Lamborghinis and Ferraris, but particularly Lamborghinis, Frank Sinatra once said, if you want to be somebody, buy a Ferrari or drive a Ferrari. If you are somebody, drive a Lamborghini, which I think is cool. I mean, nothing wrong with Ferraris, don't get me wrong, but that was just, I'm just quoting the man himself. But yes, it does make a difference who has owned the car. If they have a particularly interesting story to tell, that makes a big difference to the value. But bear in mind, when in period, because of the price and because of the fact that they were so extreme, most Countachs have got interesting stories anyway. It wasn't, you know, Mrs. Jones at number 22 Acacia Avenue who generally bought a Countach. It was a pop star, it was a captain of industry, it was a movie producer. So they've all got a story to tell. But yes, you're right, some more than others. And the exceptional cars, one springs to mind as the Countach that was owned by Ferruccio Lamborghini himself. They can be worth a multiple of similar siblings simply because of that provenance. And it all comes down to proving it, of course.
Yeah. Now, I think there was, although they did limited amounts of racing, there was a bit of an F1 connection. I know people like Mario Andretti and Gerhard Berger owned them. It was used as a pace car at the Monaco Grand Prix for a few years. But also, I think the ex-Formula One team owner, Walter Wolf, did quite a bit to kind of enhance his own car. And I think one or two other models built to a similar specification.
Well, he was the one, Walter Wolf had an enormous amount of influence, money and resources at his disposal. And he was the one who, you're quite right, he helped Lamborghini and Pirelli push the boundaries. So I'm guessing, I don't know this for sure, but there was a connection between Formula One using Pirelli tyres at the time and Lamborghini. He was a big Lamborghini fan. And I suspect he may have been instrumental in pushing Pirelli to develop a low-profile tyre for the Countach. But certainly, I think in as early as 1977, 1978, Walter Wolf actually started to build up quite a rapport with the Lamborghini factory. And he specified, he was one of the first people, if not the first, to specify these big wheel arches on the car. As I said, the normal periscopio, this was flush here. There was no flared wheel arch. But Walter Wolf must have pulled some serious strings with Pirelli and got them to develop a low-profile tyre. And his Countach from 77, 78 was, if my memory serves me correctly, the first Countach with the wider tyres and the flared bodywork. And that then was the blueprint for the production LP400S that came immediately afterwards.
Fantastic. Well, plenty to watch out there if you're going to buy a Countach yourself. So you can either take what you've learned here and go do it yourself. If you'd rather have Iain to guide you through the process, just get in touch with us through the Supercars Monaco platform. And otherwise, we look forward to seeing you in the next episode of Supercar Secrets. Thanks for joining us, and thank you, Iain.